So Majestic is ruled by a secret society, is what you're saying?
Well, Majestic has been the most famous, next to probably the Freemasons, secret society of itself. And there are many of the Freemasons who inhabit the Majestic. These associated secret societies, like the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, are then imparted into the secret society known as the Majestic.
Majestic, or Majestic12, is supposed to have been a secret group inside the US government, created after World War II to deal with things that didn't fit into normal military or scientific channels. He says their job, at least on paper, was to handle information that was considered too sensitive, too strange, or too destabilizing to be public. Now, if you search for Majestic online, most of what you'll find says that it's fake, that it's not real and there's nothing credible behind it. But let's be honest for a moment. If something like this really existed, do you think you'd be able to find clear answers on a simple Google search? Groups like that wouldn't leave a clean trail behind them. They wouldn't be documented in public, and people who speak about them wouldn't be treated kindly. They'd be questioned, discredited, or attacked. That's just how things like this tend to work. Dan says Majestic was funded through government structures, but it did not function like a normal government agency. It did not report in the usual way. It did not fall under clear political authority. One critical point he says he was present at was the T9 conference. This was a closed meeting in New Mexico where formal negotiations took place between multiple groups from different timelines. The groups present were described as future human groups, not one single group, but several, with different origins and different development paths. One of these groups was referred to as the P45, described as being 45,000 years ahead of us.
What is the T9 conference?
During the course of speaking with extraterrestrials and our interactions with them from the 1950s onward, there have been a series of treaties established between we and they. They meaning a future human intelligence, time travelers.
Alien kind by
well,
they're
humans. They're human
you
lineage.
Consider them humans.
They're humans.
Okay.
They're human beings, albeit different from what we would expect to see as a human being. But then again, if we look in the history, the presently accepted history of the evolution of humankind, if one were to walk into a conference held by Neanderthals, one would be taken aback. Well, in the same way, one may be taken aback by walking into a conference with these gentlemen.
The purpose of the T9 conference was to establish and adjust agreements between present-day institutions and several future human groups that, according to him, were able to interact with our timeline. These groups were presented as future branches of humanity, different outcomes of the same species, shaped by very different conditions over very long periods of time. Dan describes three main groups. One of them is the P45. This group is described as coming from a timeline roughly 45,000 years ahead of ours. They are presented as technologically advanced, but still relatively biologically stable. Another is referred to as the P52. They were about 52,000 years ahead of us, shaped by harsher, long-term conditions, including environmental and biological degradation. Within the P52 line, Dan describes two subgroups. One of them is often referred to as the J-rods. They're described as biologically fragile, physically weak, and highly dependent on technology to survive. Their genetic structure has degraded over time, making them increasingly reliant on artificial systems. The other P52 subgroup is referred to as the Orions, sometimes also called the Nordics or the Talls. They are described as taller, more physically robust, and more biologically stable than the J-rods, having developed along a different survival path. So these future groups were facing long-term biological collapse in their own timelines and seeking ways to stabilize or reverse that process. That is where something called the Lotus principle comes in. Lotus is described as a biological or energetic process connected to development, neurological function, and long-term genetic stability. It is presented as something rare, difficult to access, and extremely important for the future groups. Dan describes Lotus as a biological system, something that interacts with life at a very fundamental level, and this is where his own role as the biologist becomes relevant. At Majestic, they were researching Project Lotus as a biological and environmental process. It started from measurements taken in areas rich in silicon-based minerals, where unusual electromagnetic patterns could be detected. These patterns were not random noise. They showed structure, repetition, and internal coherence. More importantly, they interacted with living cells. In controlled laboratory conditions, exposure to these signals caused measurable biological effects. Cells changed their behavior. In some cases, damaged or inactive cells resumed activity in altered forms. This suggests that Lotus was not a device or a piece of technology, but a natural process embedded in the environment, capable of influencing biological systems at a fundamental level. Over time, this raised a more serious question. If such a process could affect cell function, then it could also affect long-term genetic stability, development, and degeneration across generations. That is why Lotus became important. The future groups wanted access to Lotus because it could help stabilize their genetic decline. In exchange, they offered information about future events, about long-term outcomes, about what happens if certain paths are followed. That is what makes this story uncomfortable.